Delighted to be asked to speak here with my comrade Jerry. We're going to talk to each other for about half an hour, 40 minutes, kind of trying to pull out some of the mythic elements of how we remember and memorialise Maclean, and hopefully some fruitful disagreements will come to the fore that we can then discuss as a group about some of those myths and some of those realities of his life. Tam mentioned that for a lot of people they come to Maclean for the first time through poetry and song, and we're going to talk a little bit about poetry, and we thought we'd start with Jerry giving us Sorley Maclean's poem Clan Maclean.
Clan Gillian, can you eat in a vasi on an ashton in a kitchen? Ganyan, gasket is over. Kjam oortrach a skila. A gessen van Glassego. Ursten gaha nam femach. Ian more Maclean. Kjam is fel a skila. The reason we start with that poem, and I'm not going to translate it to English, it devalues the kind of Gaelic cover, but the summary is that the whole history of the Clan Maclean is encompassed in the man John Maclean, at the battle post of the poor, Ursen Chahanum Famach, at the battle post of the poor in Glasgow. And I think it brings to mind as well, and Henry will develop that as a poet himself, Henry will develop that, but it brings other ways in which the poets, especially from the late 60s, early 70s, tried to bring in that whole mythic part of the legend of John Maclean. The Sorley called him Ian More Maclean, Great John Maclean. And that's when Great John Maclean started coming into the kind of rhetoric. But there was other words as well. I'll just quote some of the other words from some poems that are quite striking. We've got words like homage, yeah. And Maclean is at your banquet in one poem as well. The unbreakable spirit of Maclean, Scotland has needed you yet. It's almost like a second coming as well in terms of Maclean. And of course there's always that part of Hugh McDermott, Krasivy, bringing in the Russian red, Krasivy for red as well. So for me there is that part, and I'm going to pass it to Henry as well because I think Henry will develop it, that mythic quality, and think of mythic in all its senses and the kind of tradition of that word, that really Maclean started to come into his own. How do we then bring the man out from that as well?
Thanks, Jerry. It was a beautiful reading. Yeah, I've spent the last 6 months with Joey Simons putting together this book, which collects 100 years of poems and songs about Maclean, and it's a kind of an update of the book that T.S. Law and Maurice Blythman made for the 50th anniversary in '73, homage to John Maclean. And Nan Milton said at that time, in that year when the cairn went up, when John Broom's biography was published, that it was the songs and the poems that contained the real heart of the legend, that they were the key element in remembering Maclean. And Maurice Blythman and T.S. Law said in their introduction that it's poets who have the final say in who is remembered. And I think that's true of Maclean. It's Maclean's memory is handed to us more through poetry and song. It was more the work of people like Hamish Henderson, Sorley Maclean, Hugh McDermott, and Matt McGinn that brought the story of Maclean out. And I'm interested in why that is. What is it about Maclean that makes him a poetic and mythic figure? And I think part of it is that Maclean's actually quite a difficult historical character to memorialise and to commemorate. He wasn't a great theorist, he wasn't a prolific writer. He's a kind of industrial hero but was never an industrial worker. He didn't take part in a rising or rebellion. He died in his own bed. These aren't qualities that naturally create a legend around them, and yet there's elements of all those facts that are why the legend of Maclean exists, because not to kind of labour a trope of Caledonian anti-syzygy, but he exists both as a Marxist and as a nationalist hero, as a Highlander and as a Lowlander, as an industrial figure, and also as a thinker and educator. All these hard to pin down kind of dialectical and often very thrawn characteristics that he has that I think have particularly lent Maclean to poetry and song and to exploring and pulling out these different ideas. The other element I think that is key is Naomi Mitchison said of Maclean that he was a king of Strathclyde who died for his people. And that, I think, is the other key gift to poets and songwriters, and I think it's a gift he was conscious in giving, and we'll kind of go into that ideas of martyrdom and the myth of martyrdom a little bit later. But I think in many ways the reason that poets and songwriters and politicians of all stripes have been able to claim Maclean is because he truly gave himself up to the cause and for the working people. Just quickly refer to my notes, sorry. Yeah, so I think just on that subject of poetry and song, I want to say also that these myths that we're going to discuss and that come out in some of these poems and songs are, I think, extremely helpful, and I don't want anyone to think we're using the term mythic in a disparaging way. It's through these myths that we're able to live imaginatively a political life of Maclean and explore the different legacies of Maclean. As Stuart and Rosa mentioned, that it's these myths that create that sort of journey for us. It does remind me also, though, that, you know, Marx obviously told us that history repeats itself first as tragedy and then as farce, and I think that Maclean is truly a tragic character in that some of his decisions and some of his flaws, as well as his greatness, give us lessons to learn. The farce part of the quote is obviously taken care of in the many characters that have tried the Maclean act over the years, not least Tommy and George Galloway. But so we're going to move on now to perhaps one of the more contentious or a myth that we have a disagreement about, and I think you're going to speak first to it, to ideas of nationalism in the life of Maclean.
Thanks, Henry. I think it is important because it's the one thing that keeps coming up. That part after 1920, even last night at the Glasgow University event as well, the question came up about, well, was Maclean, was he wrong? It may be right today, but was he wrong in 1920 to kind of not join the Communist Party? Now, and for me, the last part of myth is narrative, isn't it? Something that narrative sticks. And there's a narrative around Maclean, from his critics, I suppose, primarily, that his nationalism, and I don't believe he was a Scottish nationalist, please don't misunderstand me, but there was a strong element of nationalism in his latter politics, and we developed that briefly. But an element that it was born of pragmatism. There was a pragmatic response to what was happening in the revolutionary movement at that time. It was born of defeat at a time when the revolutionary movement, which had been in the ascendancy maybe from 1917 after the Bolshevik victory, was going back into abeyance again. And there's a theory it was born of isolation. He was isolated, he had nowhere else to go, and he chose this line, which was for a Scottish Workers' Republic. Now, for those that know me, will know that it's a position I don't hold. But I think in the historical sense, it's important to bear in mind that they are valid views that are there. I've tried to develop in my own work and in my own research, and what was coming out for me was that it is born of Maclean's experiences, his personal experiences. I've called the chapter in my book, A Middle-Aged Man Looks at the Thistle. He'd been through a lot of personal turmoil and heartache, and even heard in the speech there in 1918 the references to his Highland upbringing, the reference to the fact that he was true to his class, as a patriot to his class, because his parents were thrown out of the Highlands. He wrote under the pseudonym Gale for the Justice newspaper for about 3-4 years, and he chose that name wisely. In fact, I found out, just a very quick aside, although he wasn't a Gaelic speaker, it wasn't seen as the language of progress in the house, but he did use it. There's an ex-BBC producer called Dean McKinnon told me that his grandfather told him he would go into pubs, not to drink, Maclean was a teetotaler, but he would get in the back room where the meetings were taking place, and he would just speak to the Gaelic landlords, oh, come here, how, jihad all, or that kid, just the basic pleasantries, that obviously it was part of who he was. He explored that. And that's very pertinent in terms of his Irish politics as well, but I'm not going to steal any thunder for talks later on, it's only my viewpoint. But I think it's very pertinent. He started to think about who he was personally. And for me, there's a mythic quality to that as well. Because a lot of people seem to think if it was a tactic, he would have moved away from that tactic. Well, actually, again, in my own research, a Scottish nationalist, the Honourable Rory Erskine of Mar, visited Maclean at his house in Aldhouse Road. And it was within a couple of months he brought out a leaflet, All Hail the Scottish Communist Republic, as it was at that time. He started to think about aspects of Scottish history that he hadn't thought about before. The Scottish Labour College had no curriculum in Scotland of Scottish history. A Labour Party member called William Dyack pointed that out in the Scottish Review. He started to then get almost like the teacher, the dominee, was being taught about Scottish history, being taught about his own country, and bring that in with what was happening in terms of his own personal reawakening as well. Something was going on. He spoke up at Arbroath at a meeting of the Scottish National League. That was the 600th anniversary in 1920 of the Declaration of Arbroath, and very characteristically said he was there to protest the use of Scottish troops in Ireland to suppress the Irish Revolution. More about that later on from my colleague Stevie as well. So there was a trajectory post 1920. He was moving in a trajectory that there was no going back from. And the myth to me, the mythic part, is that there was this tactic that Maclean chose the wrong thing. Well, again, I'm not leaving the point, but it was touch and go as to whether there would be a Scottish Communist Party. Willie Gallagher pulled out all the stops to make sure it didn't happen. And when you look at what was happening concomitantly, that's a good word there, I thought we'd throw that out for the sake of it. When you think about what was happening, also, at the same time with the Scottish Labour Party, there was a very strong small end nationalist trait there in terms of pushing for home rule. It was a choice between an autonomous movement in Scotland or to submerge yourselves within the aspiring new Communist Party of Great Britain. The latter won, but it was touch and go. And as I say, I think my book brings it out, Henry's book brings it in different ways. It brings the debate out as well. So I'll conclude and pass on for Henry's take on it by just saying that there was no going back. Maclean in 1922 started signing open letters as John Maclean, Yours for Scottish Republicanism. His latter election address is John Maclean, MA, Republican. There was no going back. He never lost his Marxism, he never lost his internationalism, but he became a Scottish Republican. And for me, that is also part of the mythic quality that influenced the songwriters, especially Hugh McDermott developing a John Maclean line later on. But I think we've got to remember that part, that All Hail the Scottish Workers' Republic was more than just a slogan. That's what I mean.
I'm going to be unpopular now because I disagree to some extent with that, and I think that is a myth in some ways that's been very useful to the propagation of a Maclean line and has been politically useful in many ways. But to me, Maclean's not a man who begins life as a sort of phlegmatic home ruler and experiences a Damascene conversion to republicanism and to Scottish nationalism. He's a man who always sees the world through the prism of Marxism and always develops his ideas and his tactics in accordance with that. And I think the interesting parallel to his use in the 1920s of republicanism is his use in the 1910s of syndicalism. And he comes up through the the Socialist Democratic Federation and opposes industrial action, views the political route to socialism as the correct method. And it's his encounters with things like the Neilston Mill strike, the Singer strike, the SLP and the various syndicalist organisers that he understands that actually a strike can be a school for revolution, and a strike can provide not just a tactic but a lived experience of politics for the people. He totally changes his politics on that, but it's always still subordinate to Marxism and his aim of a world held in common. And I think similarly, when through his encounters in prison with Irish nationalists, through his encounters with figures like Erskine of Mar, he sees a route towards that world held in common through Scottish republicanism, but it always remains subordinate to Marxism and always remains, in my opinion, a tactical means to an end rather than a thing that takes over his politics in any way. I think, though, it's interesting that you point out that it's the fact that he took on that tactic is in large part why particularly those kind of Second Coming type poems of the 60s and 70s raise up his memory so much as this kind of first figure to provide a real bridge between communism and Scottish nationalism, to offer kind of almost presaging the kind of anti-colonial struggles that came after him. that myth was perhaps tactically disastrous at the time for him. It left him isolated, it left him with certainly limited influence within the city and within the movement, but tactically in the longer term, it obviously was one of his great contributions to left thought. And so the myth remains useful, and questions, counterfactual questions of whether he might have diverted from it later or not, I think are almost not worth exploring, because the reality of what did happen, the reality of the movement and the introduction to left nationalism and the Maclean line that McDermott did are such a powerful and living part of that story. I think you're taking us to the hobby horse of religion next.
Yes, I am indeed. Yes, thanks, Henry. Thank you. I think again another mythic part. And it may not be something that we're not labelling the point. We're not here to discuss religion as such, but it's something that I've always felt important, because it's always been like a throwaway line for other writers in Maclean. He came out of a strong Calvinist household, but he rejected Calvinism and became a Marxist, and that's it. Well, we use the phrase, don't we? You can take the person out of Glasgow, but you can't take Glasgow out of the person. But you can take religion out of, or take Maclean out of religion, but you couldn't take the religion out of Maclean. And for all he was a Marxist, and he rejected the cult of Christ, and he rejected organised religion, that spiritual dimension and that Calvinism was with him all through in his life. I'll just pick up a couple of examples. Henry's going to touch on a very, very fascinating point. So I'm going to steal Henry's thunder. If you think that's Henry's point, I'll leave it at that. So my own take on it is the fact that a couple of things. First of all, I do think Maclean saw a real strand of what later became radical Christianity. I think he really saw a distinction between the 12 men in the room who wanted to share everything and change the world, to what it became. And maybe that's a human way. We can look at a lot of organisations in the left and maybe say the same type of thing in terms of the original ideal and what it became. But I think he definitely saw a distinction, and I think radical Christianity stayed with him. In 1903, a questionnaire in a local politician's paper, he named Jesus as one of his heroes as well. And a point I will come back to when we talk about the kind of madness theory as well. When he came out of jail in 1918, he made this speech, and Harry McShane recounted it as being quite erratic. And Willie Gallagher kept pulling at his jacket, telling him to sit down. And he was like, "Oh, for Christ's sake, Gallagher." He said, I want to speak. And he turned round, and the erratic comment was, there were two Jews. One thought with the heart, one thought with the head. One was Jesus, the other was Marx. Now that's not a man that abandoned, that totally lost all of that religious aspect. I also made the point in my book as well, for 3 years running, as Gale in the Justice newspaper, he reported on the United Free General Assemblies. What Marxists do you know that reports in the United Free General Assembly? Yep. And he was picking out the progressive socialist ministers who were there, who were pushing that positive vision, that radical Christianity again, which I think was there with him. He was reported a speech in Durham in 1918 to say the mantle of Jesus Christ has fallen on the Bolsheviks. Now this isn't a madman, as we'll look at later on. This is a man talking from the depths of his soul. A man who'd been through so much in prison and thinking about himself and what it meant to be himself really as well. And two final wee points. In terms of his relationship with the Reverend Richard Lee, Reverend Richard Lee was a Unitarian minister who he got very friendly with. And they started exchanging some letters, and Maclean praised one of his pamphlets. He wrote a few pamphlets, Richard Lee. As a free thinker, he called God our comrade. That was his kind of point. He wanted the dynamite of God to blow away the churches. That was his viewpoint. Now, there's a photograph. It's in my book, but it's kind of blurred. There's a better photograph in Daniel Craig's 4-minute video on YouTube, which is the People's Historian. And the Reverend Richard Lee at John Maclean's secular service, right? And it's just stuck with me. I'm just throwing it out there to you, but without any other comment. The Reverend Richard Lee's got his hand in prayer at John Maclean's secular service. Just something to think about. And the other thing as well, in terms of, again, the whole mythic quality of Maclean, without undermining his Marxism at all, is the fact that just before or his last stint in prison, he struck up a friendship, and Nan recounts this in her book, Nan Milton's daughter, where he attended some kind of services. And when he came out from there, his last stint in prison, and he started speaking in almost in religious terms again. You know, I wish to curse the curse and all those who oppose social salvation. There was something that just kept drawing him in. And I think it's a spiritual dimension rather than a religious dimension. But I think it's important to see the man in terms of seeing that, rather than just sweeping it under the carpet as if it's not part of his story.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that's just absolutely fascinating that you can't separate Maclean from the Kirk, that it surrounds him at every turn. And that phrase of his, the mantle of Christ has descended upon the Bolsheviks, I think is just a fascinating way to go with him on that journey, from understanding what he did about sacrifice and about the message of Christ that he did admire and embrace, and of course that he believed had failed, and that he thought a next step in the journey was necessary. I think the question about the Reverend Richard Lee is always really interesting, and it's worth remembering that Agnes Maclean, her family were Christian socialists in Hawick, and that's how she came to the movement and how she met Maclean. And to what extent that remained present in that household is a question we don't know, but I think certainly as she was there organising the funeral, and that she chose for a minister to be there at the funeral is perhaps tells us something about the part that religion still played in that family. The other religious aspect I wanted to light upon was this idea of martyrdom, and the centrality of martyrdom to the Christian faith and to coming up through that. And another link from Maclean to Christianity that's actually come to light recently through Patricia Krus's research at the Carnegie Trust is that Maclean actually, first of all, received a Carnegie grant to study, which is a kind of great link between the terrors of Andrew Carnegie and the great working class leader John Maclean, but also that it looks like, and we need to go through the university archives, but it looks like perhaps Maclean enrolled in divinity in the first instance, and although we know he took his degree in political economy, I think that would be an interesting aspect to find out more about. But yeah, martyrdom, and particularly the martyrdom of Jesus and of the saints, I think really provided Maclean with a prototype for what he chose to do with his life. There's an interesting challenge in commemorating Maclean, in that I think he likely wouldn't want to be commemorated. The idea of a conference discussing him rather than the movement is not something that I think would have pleased him. But what he chose to do was to embody that movement and to sacrifice himself to that movement. And whilst obviously his death in 1923 can be viewed as that, I think the crucial moment for understanding that is the speech that Tam gave us just now. In 1918, when Maclean was heading to the High Court, he would have had in his mind very strongly that Connolly had been shot and that Casement had been hanged, and that those were prototypes for what might happen to him, and that he was willing to face that, and was, if he was not to be given that sentence, that he was willing to undergo a hunger strike to death, that he could see in the spirit of what he was learning about the value of the Easter Rising, in the spirit of the Haymarket martyrs, that potentially his martyrdom would be his final commitment to the cause. And I think the fact of his death years later, undeniably brought on by his experiences in prison, by his treatment by the British state, really fulfills that mission of his to pursue the cause of the working class to his own death. But I also think there's another thing that comes up in that death, age 44, that's worth exploring, which is that, and it always strikes me that 44 is the age that his father died at, of silicosis, and the fact that at age 44 Maclean had lost his father, his mother, his brothers, and all but one of his sisters. So there were only two of that family, that large family, still living by the time he was 44. And the experience of survivor's guilt, the experience of the incredible sacrifices that his family made in order for him to have this education, in order for him to live this life, surely played some part in his own ideas of sacrifice. And those own ideas of sacrifice, I think, play a great part in our understanding of his myth. I'm going to hand back to Jerry.
Thanks, Henry, thank you. I think one aspect that we both discussed in advance as well, I think where man and myth collide, and we can't avoid that. Again, it'd be easy to sweep under the carpet as someone who's been, who's kind of resisted it. I mean, I was secretary of the John Maclean Society at 19. I would describe myself as a Macleanite. I'm not hiding any like personal bias or anything like that. That's where I'm coming from. But in the same token, you view things differently the older that you do get. So I'm 54 now. And I think the whole madness theory is something I think we need to kind of talk about today, because it's never gone away. It's never gone away. There's always that kind of that inference that maybe he was unhinged, that maybe he did what he did because something was wrong psychologically within him. And I think that the starting point is to say that there's no doubt he was affected by what happened in prison. It was a brutal regime. That psychologically and physically he was almost broken, you know, and he came out in that 1918 hustings that I mentioned. People just noticed something different. They didn't understand that, as I say, it was maybe just speaking from those experiences from his soul. They just saw, wait a minute, this is not the John Maclean we remember from last year, or 1916, speaking in the hustings. And also I did try to start to talk about his Highland spirit. He made big mention of that at the hustings as well. By the way, he was standing for the Labour Party. They had adopted him as a candidate for the Gorbals in 1918. And a lady from the floor stood up and said, you have the support of all the Irish Republicans of Glasgow. You know, so there was something different in terms of going on. But in terms of the whole thing about madness, it started to escalate after that. And well, as I say, there's no doubt that he wasn't the same man. I think it would be prudish to say that. I think there's a different light which Henry will bring on that we can look at in terms of that. But Gallagher plays a large part in it. And we can't take away from the fact that that political struggle to form the Communist Party played a large part in that theory, that view of Maclean as a sick, ill man who surrounded himself with cronies. It was all a narrative that began at the time. You know, another good word, contemporaneously. I'll use big words today, trying to impress you. But it began at the time, but then from there, then Gallagher developed it in his memoirs. Gallagher actually put it in writing to a member of the Socialist Labour Party to say that Maclean was unhinged, he was having episodes. And this SLP member who knew Maclean and liked him passed on to him. So the relationship between Gallagher and Maclean was finished after that. It was gone. In fact, it almost came to blows at a meeting around the issue of the Scottish Communist Party at Christmas Day in 1920. But it was pernicious. Now, again, take a step back. If Gallagher believed it to be true, then you can understand it. Right? I'm not here to denigrate Gallagher. This idea about Maclean, not to denigrate Gallagher. He did what he did for his party. He did what he did. He believed it was right. But if he believed it was true, the problem is that he did not engage in any political debate with Maclean or with the Scottish Workers' Republican Party. The madness theory was used to make sure that there was no debate, no discussion. Maclean was unhinged, and therefore we've got to move on and build a movement without him. So think of the snowball effect. How would it make you feel? Yeah, and there was no real talk about depression and the kind of effects that Maclean would have been going through, the frustrations, the isolation as well. And he didn't choose isolation, by the way. Isolation was forced on him. Yeah, he didn't choose it. So that those things are all built up into a theory. They left a big question mark hanging over him. And the legend, the myth of the songwriters and the poets could sweep around that quite easily. But the politicals in debate couldn't sweep around that. So how do you engage when the person you're talking about is meant to be unhinged or mad? The madness theory plays a large part in two aspects. In terms of the isolation of Maclean, but also in the rehabilitation of him. Because even when the Communist Party started writing pamphlets from the late 30s and 40s, and that included Harry McShane, that included Billy Gallagher, that included Tom Bell, they all started praising the great John Maclean before 1918. And even if you read if you've got the collected works of Lenin, the little footnote from the Soviet editors finishes at 1918. Yep. And actually, I came across a paper which articulates it for the first time that he was deselected he was deselected as Soviet consul. Everybody was a great player, the fact he was made Soviet consul by Lenin, they deselected him. And this paper actually says that it was some Communist Party members over Moscow were told by Lenin that he was no longer Soviet consul. How would that make you feel? Yeah. So we've got to, I think, look at it through different glasses, through different lenses now, in terms of where we are just now. It was a political debate that didn't take place, and as I say, it contributed a large part to the man and myth of Maclean. Thank you.
Thanks, Jerry. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that there's an importance in talking about madness and accusations of madness, and I think in sort of rehearsing some of those quite bitter discussions that have been had about Maclean, both when he was alive and, you know, again in the 30s, in the 60s and in the 70s, I think it strikes me that it's really that the paradigm has moved on for how we understand this. That kind of questions like, did Maclean have a psychotic break in prison? Were his ideas of being poisoned overvalued delusions, or was there reality to them? Was this a kind of pernicious attack by the CP? Were people like Dora Montefiore and Willie Gallagher trying to make Maclean the first kind of unperson of the Communist Party, or did they sincerely believe these things? Were his splits with the nascent Communist Party and his splits with Lenin due to being unstable? I think these questions are kind of old hat in a way, and that maybe we should be thinking more about how to synthesize and understand what happened to Maclean and view his health in a different way. And actually, we now live in a time where I think there's a great deal more sympathy and understanding for the fact that, of course, he was under huge emotional, physical and psychological strain in Peterhead, and that the impact on that was momentous. I don't think anyone that has read Maclean's letters cannot see that in that period, that, you know, that his writing and his excitement after visits and in contacting family, some of the things he has to say to comrades and to Agnes are disturbing. And I also don't think anyone that reads Maclean's letters can honestly say that he's not just as sharp and just as piercing in his intellect in the years following prison as he was before. The idea that there's some falling off a cliff that happens after this point, I think is a fiction. But I do think that we should be, you know, thinking about and understanding Maclean having some kind of break in prison and what that meant to him, and approaching that with empathy and with interest, rather than using it as a political tool from either side. I'm also reminded of that other, you know, great Glaswegian radical R.D. Laing saying that, you know, there's a relation between breakdowns and breakthroughs, and that something of value also happened to Maclean in that process. So yeah.
I'm going to come back to just one thing, and I'll move on to the next part we develop as well. And that's the fact that there's a letter from Nan in the 1930s to Hugh McDermott, where she said that she remembers our mother Agnes recounting the fact that before the war, before 1914, Maclean was quite whimsical. You know, he didn't have a great sense of humour, but even his writing style was quite whimsical. Harry McShane said he had one joke: the Clan Maclean had a boat of their own. That was his joke, you know. But he didn't. But he was quite whimsical. When he came out of jail in 1922, he was whimsical again. And that point of a breakthrough, well, for all that he'd actually been through, he started writing letters to my dear Pietro, meaning Peter Marshall, hoping his garden was okay, and telling Agnes to remember him in her prayers, you know, with 5 exclamation marks behind it as well. So there was something different that it's almost he came through it. And I think that's worth bearing in mind. And it links in with the next thing we wanted to look at, which was the whole aspect of family. And I think it's important as a man in myth as well that we're not here for any kind of hagiography at all. We're here to remember, commemorate, as Henry said, the flaws, where he confounds us, where he inspires us. And in terms of family, I think it's important. My own personal belief is Maclean's politics was an addiction to him. Like any addiction, it's not healthy, it's not good. Yeah? And that's why you couldn't see, either from comrades, when comrades were asked them to take a step back in 1918 after the December 18 election, not we couldn't take a step back. He thought they were undermining him. as well, and that's again part of the prison experiences, but also it took its toll on Nan as well. When Nan started asking him to take a little step back. Even came back as well when Nan, when there was a reconciliation, Nan left him just about that period. And when he took ill in 1923, there was a kind of reconciliation. Nan kind of came back for a spell. She asked him not to take part in the last election campaign, which was when he died in November 23. That was the election which returned the Labour government, I think I'm right to say, wasn't it? Returned the first Labour government. He died just before the actual count of that election. Nan told him not to take part, but he took part. Now, he was wrong, wasn't he? You've got to listen. You've got to listen to your loved ones, listen to your friends, listen to what your body's telling you. You know, but he kept going on because the revolution was in there. The revolution wouldn't wait, the revolution wouldn't stop. And I suppose, to be fair, would you have came out today for John Maclean, good dad, good husband? Probably not, you know. So there's something in, I suppose, that sacrifice and that kind of martyrdom that draws us in as well. But we still want to be aware of the fact in terms of that family situation. And I remember being asked at a meeting years ago, there was a political meeting, there wasn't a commemoration list. What would you have wished for John Maclean? What would you have wanted? I think everybody expected me to say, the Scottish Workers' Republic or a Socialist Republic for Scotland. And my answer wasn't that. My wish for John Maclean was that he lived to see his daughters grow up. Yeah? Jean was 13, Nan was 10 when he passed away. And they had to live with that, and they coped with it in very, very different ways, which probably isn't the time and the place to go into here. But we've got to bear that in mind, you know. You've got to bear that in mind. There was an element of choice, and that choice was Maclean's.
Yeah, I think that's a deeply moving insight, and I think the thing I would say about the myth of Maclean and his relation to that decision to not put his family first, to not listen to Agnes, is that while we wouldn't necessarily turn out for John Maclean, good husband, good dad, it is crucial to the myth of Maclean and to the humanising of Maclean that Agnes returned in that final month. It's a kind of interesting and redemptive gift that she offered to him, and then I think offers to how we're able to remember him, because it is a bitter and hard thing to go through that period of his life where he mistrusts her, where he believes that the government has got to her in some way, that she's acting against the revolution, when it's, I think, plain to anyone that she was acting out of love and concern. And you also lit on the legacy of his daughters. That's the other, key element of his family, is that Nan Milton Maclean is obviously the person that gives us the most of the legacy and memory of her father, and devotes her life to writing, and then after C.L.R. James loses it, rewriting the great biography of Maclean. Whereas Jean moved away, both physically moved away to the northeast, and also politically moved away, kind of not engaging with the labour movement, not engaging with particularly the memory of John Maclean. And I think that's quite telling, that the older daughter would have done that, the daughter that would have seen more of what happened, more of the effect of the movement on Maclean, more of the effect of his life on her mother, that she didn't wish to necessarily celebrate or engage with John Maclean's memory in the same way. Although, speaking to her son Ellis, John Maclean's grandson, he was telling me that whilst John Maclean was really never spoken of in the house, in Jean's house, wasn't really talked about particularly, that when Archie Hines' Shoulder to Shoulder play about Maclean's life came up to Aberdeen, that they went and that Jean wept through it, and after that came down to the Cairn commemorations and did in some ways reconcile some of the experiences of growing up around a myth, around a legend, which I think is an extremely challenging thing. And I'm going to lead into that from just some of my kind of closing personal remarks, and then Jerry, I'll let you wrap us up. But I want to say that what I thought about quite a lot when writing the biography was what is the point in commemorating Maclean? Like, what are we trying to do with that legacy? Are we trying to continue his work? Is this a work of Marxist education? Are we trying to create a political icon that we can live through politically and explore our own political futures as a working class movement. And I think certainly those things are true. Those are some of the things that both the myth and the man offer to us. I also think that that Marxist biography offers us a chance to think about how we as Marxists or socialists or whatever persuasion you might be should live a good life. How should we square our actions with our convictions? And I think that some of the greatest lessons to be learned from Maclean are in a steadfast understanding of morality and applying that morality to the world around us. And whenever people ask questions of what would Maclean's take on this today be and what would his take on that today be, I think that it's often surprisingly easy to answer those questions because our concerns remain the same. They remain the battle for safe housing, the battle for fair work, the stand against imperialism, and the way in which he chose to live and give himself to those fights, I think, are clear lessons for us still today. It's a real privilege to get to talk to you at this event, and I'll pass over to Jerry now.
Thank you, Henry. Now, again, I'll conclude very briefly. This is part of a cycle of commemorations that are very, very important. It began in 1948, where the Scotland USSR Society met to commemorate Maclean, 25 years after his death. Willie Gallagher, believe it or not, spoke on the greatness of John Maclean. So there you go, they can always rewrite a little bit of history. And the John Maclean March was sung for the first time by a guy called William Noble, and Hamish Henderson was actually in the crowd. William Noble was there. Obviously, jumped 25 years later, and you've got the Cairn 1973, an old commemoration around that as well, and in 1979, 100th anniversary of his birth. And then 25 years ago, an event which I helped to organise as well at the Arches as well, where there was again the kind of great John Maclean night, and Hamish actually stood up and sung the John Maclean March. First time I heard Hamish actually sing the John Maclean March himself. No doubt he'd done it many a time, but it's the first time I heard him. So this is important, the 100th commemoration is part of that cycle. I'm 54, in 25 years till I'll be 79. I'm hoping to be at the next one, all going well as well, whatever that next commemoration may be. But I would like to finish off with just a kind of quote. I think my favourite quote from Maclean. It was his very last election address, where obviously he died. He didn't get to see it, but he mentioned that in the last paragraph that what he stood for was world peace and economic security for the human family. The John Maclean doesn't have all the answers. We're not going to go to a manifesto and build a new Scotland just around the ideas of John Maclean. I don't suggest that for a second, but he'll contribute and he'll be part of that. But that vision, I think, of world peace and economic security for the human family couldn't define internationalism any better, and in terms of what we are. And for us in Scotland to play a part in that, yeah, I think it is absolutely key, and that for me is the main reason for commemorating John Maclean. And hopefully our discussion today will generate some good discussion and questions from your good selves. But thank you very much.